Missouri Irish, the original history of the Irish in America, 1770 to 1900 AD, as written by Michael C. O'Laughlin. Audio edition, narrated by Molly Nickle. Recorded at the Irish Roots Cafe. Brought to you by IrishRoots.com, copyright 1984 and 2010 by the author. Dedicated to those who did not survive the crossing, and to O'Laughlin and Donahue who did.
Missouri Irish, the original history of the Irish in Missouri by Michael C. O'Laughlin. Chapter 1. Indian Mounds and Tara Hills. Sacred Indian mounds were still being used when Coronado entered the territory in 1541. Two types of Indian were present: nomadic hunters and those living in straw houses raising maize, beans, and melons. The large-scale earthen temples later came to represent their lost culture. In Ireland, the Gaelic chiefs were surrendering their lands in return for titles of English nobility. King Henry's policy of surrender and regrant was undermining the old Irish way of life. The Indian lands west of the Mississippi lay heir to total strangers. After centuries of development, the Indian culture was being displaced. The tribes now living in the West had originally dwelt east of the river. The Osage, Omaha, and Missouri Indians gradually moved west as warring took place between rival tribes. The Comanche and Apache repeated this pattern further south in Texas. The Indian had farmed the Mississippi bottomland for centuries. By 1798, things had changed drastically. The Missouri Indians, after whom the river and state are named, had been destroyed. The Irish made a group settlement in the Bois Brule Bottom, following the early French and Spanish settlers. By 1821, as part of the first migration after Missouri statehood, Southerners took over the rich bottom lands. Many arrivals from the southern states were of Irish heritage. The white man forced the final westward movement of the Indian. Guns, horses, cities, and armies arrived to destroy the Indian culture. By 1827, overland trade from Franklin, Missouri, moved west to Independence. St. Joseph came to serve the overland and Oregon trails leading further west. Over 200,000 Murphy wagons would be made in St. Louis as the preferred method of travel on the frontier. The railroad followed with another wave of Irish immigrants and laborers. The new Americans were here to stay. Two famines. The buffalo of the American Plains Indian was being slaughtered at the rate of 250,000 a year by 1848. The disappearance of the buffalo brought great hunger to the Indian, marking the end of a way of life. That same year, the worst famine known to Ireland continued to bring the Irish to America. Both the Indian and the Irish had lived off the land in tribal groups led by a male chief to whom they pledged allegiance. Both were introduced to modern-day cities by invaders from across the ocean. Nuttall said of the Indian, quote, "Unacquainted with laws and governed by custom, they acknowledge no ruler beyond the senior of the common family or tribe," unquote. The same type of comment had been made about the Irish centuries earlier. The Indian and the Irish were called savage by those who came to conquer them. As the Indian way of life was dying, the Irish Americans were being born. Upon one of the sacred Indian mounds in St. Louis, O'Fallon built his house. Having arrived in Missouri prior to statehood, the O'Fallons were a wealthy and prominent family. Representative of a lost culture in Ireland, they knew that they were descended from the Gaelic kings of Ireland, the O'Fallons, princes of the Desi. As such, they were heir to the traditions of the ancient capital of Ireland, the Hills of Tara. Tara Hills. The mounds of earth which formed the hills of Tara stood at the height of Gaelic culture 2,000 years ago. National fairs took place here prior to the coming of Christianity. Chieftains and lawgivers orally recorded important births, battles, and legends at Tara. Traditions and beliefs were given authenticity. The word went forth from Tara and became a part of the fabric of Irish society. As the bard or storyteller approached a distant community, excitement would abound in anticipation of the tales of Tara. A patriarchal society, only descendants of the original Gaelic families could rule in Ireland. Pedigrees were carefully kept and recorded at Tara for this reason. They were recited orally throughout the country. Hence, the gift of fluency came to be respected by the Irish people. This fluency led them towards endeavors in politics, journalism, and law in America. Allegiance was given to an individual under the old Irish social structure. Members of the clan were pledged to their leader. The government was viewed with distrust by the Catholic majority. Public officials and government edicts were to be circumvented, and clan ties maintained. One such tie between the members of the clan was their religion. In America, the Irish congregated in the cities and were described as clannish. The informal structure of the clan survived here, extended to include all Irish. A strong identity was maintained between the members of this greater clan. In proximity to other Irish immigrants, the social order could be maintained through personal allegiances and the church. Oral fluency, strong personal allegiance, the ability to operate behind the scene, and clannishness led to the rise of the Irish politician in America. The recognition of the strength of the people beyond government control led to contributions in journalism and communications. The continuing success of the Irish-American politician depended upon his ability to reconcile differences between groups. The necessity of political compromise was well known by the Irish. They had learned to survive in a politically hostile environment centuries ago. Immigration. The Ulster Presbyterians, Scots-Irish, arrived early in America. Between 1718 and 1775, over 200,000 settled on the Appalachian frontier, eventually to play a large role in American Revolution. A rugged, independent people, they were well suited to the rigors of frontier life. Many would cross the Mississippi, passing through or settling in Missouri. The poverty of Ireland led to immigration in the 1700s. Lord Chesterfield, Lord Lieutenant from 1745 to 46, stated that, quote, "The poor people of Ireland are used worse than Negroes," unquote. The mere fact that such statements were frequently made gives us an idea of the Irishman's plight. The mortality rates of the immigrants sailing to America from Ireland far exceeded that of the Negro slaves. The slaves were valuable property, the Irish merely cargo or ballast for the return trip to America. A few basic rights were given to the Irish people in 1793. Catholics could now practice law, carry arms, and intermarry with Protestants. Not until 1829, with the coming of Daniel O'Connell, would emancipation be hailed more fully in the political arena. Religious ties and conflict. The O'Fallon family was typical of many. Having served in the Revolutionary War, they subsequently settled in the Northeast and arrived in St. Louis prior to statehood in 1821. The O'Fallon name was of ancient Gaelic heritage. The Gaels ruled Ireland prior to the coming of Christianity. Some 2,000 years ago, the entire island was pagan. With the arrival of Christianity, the O'Fallons became Catholic. Upon arrival in Missouri, they were Protestant. Later still in America, some of the O'Fallon family became Catholic again. Those religious ties raise interesting questions. Members of the same family are found practicing different religions. Some Catholics converted to the state religion in Ireland. It had been necessary to do so in order to own land or live a normal life. There was much pressure to convert. The lack of religious facilities on the frontier led to religious changes. Living in isolation, man's need for God outweighed any particular brand of salvation. Evidenced the Reverend J.J. Hogan when settling the Irish wilderness. Many in the area knew that they had been Catholic generations ago, but there had been no church or priest to serve them. The Catholic and Protestant assimilated with ease in the early years. By mid-century, things would change. The city of St. Louis was 60% foreign-born, one-third of whom were Irish. Many established citizens were threatened by the arrival of the poverty-stricken immigrants. The ability of the early settlers to live side by side with differing beliefs contributed to the greatness of America. Irish-born Joseph Charles spoke with a powerful voice on the need for unity among all Americans. All men needed to work together in a spirit of cooperation. Charles, a Presbyterian, established the first newspaper west of the Mississippi and preached accordingly in his paper. Animosity. Despite the fact that the Irish and Scots-Irish were of common heritage, animosities did exist. Differing lifestyles and economic conditions led to prejudice. There was plenty of room for expansion and opportunity in the early years. Conflict was relatively rare, and according to Ellis, intermarriage among groups was common in Missouri. Differences were put aside as a practical matter of survival on the frontier. Problems increased as the older settlers became established and new waves of immigrants began to arrive. One of the earliest examples of such animosity in Missouri follows. From Houck's History of Missouri, Peter McCormick opened a farm in 1802. In 1818, he was an active Methodist with an interest in education, characteristic of the Irish in Missouri. He was an old settler, a backwoodsman with little education, but with good common sense and a desire to educate the community. He called upon his friends in Herculaneum, quote, to send him a rail teacher, none of those whiskey-drinking Irishmen such as got in our settlement last year, or, as sure as I'm a Methodist, we'll lynch him, unquote. A sad thought it is that those who bear a common heritage with common surnames and languages have spent so much energy in conflict. Religious overtones contributed to the settlement of the Irish born in America. Both Presbyterian and Catholic were at odds with the established Church of Britain at times. The Irish population was traditionally of the Roman Catholic religion. This upset British attempts to establish a new order in Ireland. The official religion of Ireland was therefore declared to be Anglican. The early 1600s saw the first Presbyterian settlements from Scotland arrive in Northern Ireland. Half of Northern Ireland's Protestants today are said to have descended from the Scottish Presbyterians settled by King James I of England. Many ancient Irish families were displaced by these settlements. By the end of the century, 20% of the population would own 86% of the land. Small immigration to America began during this time period. It was substantial for the day. Property was the key to political power at that time, not population. The transfer of the land and its power in Ireland resulted in hatred and animosity. It led further to economic, religious, and class differences that plague Northern Ireland to this day. Ulster Presbyterians. Religious discrimination was a fact of life for the Irish Catholic. Until the Act of 1704, all Protestants enjoyed equal rights under the law. The Presbyterians had grown so strong, however, that the established church was threatened. The Ulster Presbyterians were prevented from participating in national life in any official capacity by the sacramental test added to the 1704 Act. Another factor encouraging immigration from Ulster was the passage of harsh trade laws imposed by Britain upon the Northern Irish economy. Immigration to America during the 1700s is generally accepted as coming from the province of Ulster in Northern Ireland. According to reports of the day, the immigrants were generally dissenters, very few churchmen or Catholics. Life west of the Mississippi River. Major differences existed between the lands east and west of the Mississippi in 1800. A geographical barrier, the river was a major means of transportation as well. Life along its western bank assumed a different character than that of the east. Physical, social, religious, and political contrast separated the two. The land west of the Mississippi held the following characteristics. Physically, it was cut off from the east by the river. Politically, it had been controlled by the French and Spanish regimes. Religiously, its background was primarily Roman Catholic. Socially, a simple frontier lifestyle prevailed in the undeveloped land. Physically, land west of the Mississippi did not become American property until 1804. Viewed as unknown wasteland by many, pioneer settlements had been made by the French and Spanish in the 1700s. Population was sparse, and small towns served as outposts for trading operations. Geographically, the Mississippi was a stopping point in the development of America. Missouri would not be admitted to the Union until 1821. By that time, the Irish had assumed a major role in the city of St. Louis, which was to become the city west of the Mississippi River. France and Spain controlled the lands west of the Mississippi prior to 1804. Both regimes were of Roman Catholic religion. Elsewhere, there was prejudice against the Catholic. Here, they were readily accepted. Religion, by 1800, was less of an issue on the frontier than it was back east. In St. Louis, Protestant and Catholic lived together on an equal footing under American control. By 1820, many Irish-born had risen dramatically on the financial and social scene of that city. In early St. Louis, members of different religious groups supported each other. The pew holders and contributors to the first Catholic churches include some of the most prominent Protestant Irish in the city. Included among these was the previously mentioned Joseph Charles, an Irish-born Presbyterian. The Masons of early St. Louis were Catholic and Protestant alike. The early Irish Catholic settler had received a warm welcome because of the prevailing religious and political background of the town. This welcome was extended to all Americans in the earliest days of the 1800s. Politically, France and Spain had been enemies of Great Britain. The Irishman allied himself against Britain with the help of these two nations throughout history. Many Irish, Catholic, and Protestant alike fled to France and Spain in opposition to Britain. Countless numbers joined the armed forces of these two nations as a result. In 1691, after the fall of Limerick, thousands of Irish fled to the armies of France. Some of the Irish-born arriving in St. Louis were familiar with the French lifestyle. Joseph Charles fled to France as a result of an unsuccessful rebellion. John Malanphy had been to France and later sent his son there. Malanphy was reputed to be the wealthiest man west of the Mississippi. Luke Lawless joined the French forces in 1810, coming from Dublin. A lawyer, he helped found a paper in opposition to Charles in St. Louis. All of these men spent time in France before coming to the former French colony of St. Louis. Their knowledge of the French helped them to become leading citizens on the frontier. Alexander O'Reilly left Ireland to join the military of Spain. In 1770, he commanded the Spanish Armada at New Orleans, becoming military governor of the lands west of the Mississippi. Owing to his politics, no favors were granted to the English on the river. For the Irish, the reception was a bit more cordial. The Irish immigrant was socially more acceptable in the West. Established as a fur trading post in 1764, high society did not reign in St. Louis. The leading citizens of the day had no carpet upon their floors. The Irishman had rarely escaped poverty. In the simple lifestyle of St. Louis, he was on an equal footing with most. Irishmen like Brady and McKnight would travel down the river prior to 1820 and become leading citizens and taxpayers in town. The land needed settlers. Those who would brave the hardships were welcome, rich or poor. The French and Spanish influence would soon decline. The stage had been set for a warm welcome to the poor Irish immigrant. By 1820, they became the largest immigrant group in the city. Further west in Kansas City, a toast would be made to the original French settlers years later. Sadly, no Frenchman was present to respond to the honor. The Irish were toasted that same night for contributions they would make in the future. They had already begun building the streets of the city in 1856. The French and Spanish regimes had set the stage for the arrival of new Americans west of the Mississippi. The Irish were the largest foreign-born group in America from 1800 to 1850. By 1880, the immigration figures had declined dramatically. The Irish influence had already been made. The old Irish who settled in St. Louis at the beginning of the century and the new famine Irish had risen into the mainstream of American life. So we begin our story with an overwhelming amount of facts and names. Beginning in 1750, the following pages only scratch the surface. Personality Profile. Count Alexander O'Reilly was born at Baltrasna, County Meath, Ireland. He joined a Hiberni regiment in Spain, served in Italy and then Austria under his fellow Irishman, Field Marshal de Lacy. His wartime experience included French, Spanish, Cuban, and Algerian campaigns. In 1769, commanding a Spanish armada of 3,000 men, he served as Captain General of Louisiana, including Missouri. He is credited with outlining much of the governmental policy of St. Louis. By his command, Piernis was sent to the fur trading post of St. Louis to establish control of Upper Louisiana. O'Reilly's appearance at the mouth of the Mississippi at New Orleans led to formal control of the area by Spain on May 20, 1770. English subjects who traveled up the Mississippi received no favor from him. Considering his politics and the conditions in Ireland at that time, his alliance with the Spanish forces comes as no surprise. His role in the development of the West continued for many years. An Irish merchant of New Orleans, Oliver Pollock, borrowed $70,000 from Count O'Reilly to finance troops for the Illinois campaign. These troops were led by General George Rogers Clark, the son of an Irishman, in order to check English progress on the frontier. O'Reilly came to govern the lands of Missouri and the rest of Louisiana Territory in 1770. His descendants lived in Cuba for some time, and a street in Havana was named O'Reilly in his memory. Early Irish in Missouri, 1770 to 1804. The Irish west of the Mississippi have been ignored. Existing histories cover few contributions prior to the famine era. A brief review of the Spanish records prior to acquisition of the lands by America shows the Irish influence emerging. A complete Irish settlement was in existence in 1798. The Irish organized the first ethnic benevolent society under American rule in 1818. The German immigrant did not arrive until decades later. Irish contributions played a major role in Missouri becoming a territory in 1812 and a state in 1821. They were second to none in the range of their accomplishments prior to Missouri statehood. Early peoples. The earliest inhabitants of Missouri included 1. The native Indian, 2. The French, and 3. The Spanish, prior to American acquisition of the lands in 1804. The Indians survived the French and Spanish regimes, but vanished under American rule. They came in search of gold, on missionary journeys, or trapping and hunting in the plentiful wilderness. This pattern continued, eventually reaching Oregon and California through Missouri. The Irish-born made a major impact on the development of the Louisiana Territory beginning in the 1700s. Many born in Ireland during that century played an important role in the settlement of the western frontier. Malanphy, Charles, and Lawless all traveled to France before their arrival at the French settlement of St. Louis. Their understanding of the French helped them in their endeavors in America. The first Irish immigrants arrived decades prior to these outstanding Irishmen of the early 1800s. The French and Spanish regimes. The Irish were prominent in the French and Spanish military forces. In 1663, Marquis de Tracy was Governor General of all the French possessions in America. In 1751, Chevalier McCarthy was Commandant of the French settlement of the Illinois Territory. The Irish were no less prominent in the Spanish regime. In 1770, Count O'Reilly commanded the Spanish Armada as the governor of the Louisianas, which included the lands of Missouri. An early Irish governor of the state, he was the first of many to follow. Spanish place names and French pedigrees attest to the fact of their explorations here. The Irish lay claim to the same testimony, as evidenced by the following Celtic Missouri place names. Cities and towns: Campbell, Adena, Glasgow, Glasgow Village, Kearney, Lowry City, Murphy, O'Fallon, Scott City, Sullivan, Erie. Counties: Sullivan, Callaway, McDonald, Scotland, Scott, and Shannon. Other places: Mackenzie Creek, McDonald Branch in Caldwell County, Kennedy's Fort in Warren County. And a list from an atlas of the 1800s in Missouri. Gallagher, Gilmore, Irish Grove in Milton County, Caseyville, McCartney's Crossroad in DeKalb County, McClurg in Benton Johnson County, McCready in Callaway County, McCullough in Sullivan County, McDowell in Berry County, McGurk's in Highland County, Max Creek in Camden County, Scotland in Jasper County, Scottsville in Sullivan and Jasper County, and Dublin. Documented settlers in the 1700s. Existing documents represent only fragments of the past. We can, however, look towards well-known Irish surnames in determining ethnic identity. Of unrecorded settlers and unrecognizable surnames, we remain at a loss. Existing documents and commentaries give us a glimpse of the Irish in the Spanish regime. Even well-known Irish surnames were altered beyond recognition. Early Spanish documents recorded Irish surnames in the following ways. The Irish surname of Dolan was recorded as Doln, D-O-U-L-N, or Dowlin, D-O-W-L-I-N. The Irish surname of Kavanaugh was recorded as C-A-V-E-N-A-G-H-T-S. The Irish surname of McMullen was recorded as M.Mullen, M-U-L-L-E-N. The Irish surname of McIntosh was recorded as M.Kentock, K-E-N-T-O-C-K-E. The Irish surname of Cassidy was recorded as Cahidi, C-O-J-I-D-I. The Irish surname of O'Brien was recorded as O'Bune, O''B-U-N-E. The Irish surname of McCormick was recorded as McCorniss, M''C-O-R-N-I-S-S. The Irish surname of McGee was recorded as McGee, M-C-G-U-I. The Irish surname of O'Hara was recorded as Ora, capital O-R-R-A. The Irish surname of O'Sullivan was recorded as capital W, capital S, U-L-L-I-V-A-N. The Irish surname of Jacob O'Reilly was recorded as Jacobo Riley, R-I-E-L-L-Y. In 1755, the 18th Royal Irish, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Wilkins, was stationed at Fort de Chartres. Wilkins, unpopular with the population in English Illinois, was relieved from command in 1771. In that year, O'Reilly had control of the neighboring Louisiana Territory for Spain. The 18th Royal Irish and O'Reilly were at opposite ends of the political spectrum. Matthew Kennedy, a resident of St. Genevieve, Missouri, was in St. Louis as early as 1771. That same year, he executed a bond to Antoine Bernard. Kennedy was an estate overseer. He is also the first Irishman on record to have been killed by the Indians, as well as the first documented Irish surname found in St. Louis. In the will of Jan Lewis Lambert, who died in St. Louis in 1771, a memoranda of indebtedness was found due Morrissey and Company. During that same decade, Charles Gratiot was a member of the firm of David McCrae and Company at Cahokia from 1771 to 1781. Peter Conley was a witness to Laclede's will, and Joseph O'Neill received one of the first mortgages in the early town of St. Louis during this period. In the summer of 1799, a party of 5 men would descend the Ohio River on the way to Louisville. Andrew Coyle, Terrence Mooney, Patrick Schoen, Aaron Barrett, and Andrew MacDonald were forerunners of the great migration to follow. Antoine Aubuchon was recorded in the area in 1766 as the son of Elizabeth Delaney. The first documented Irish Catholic was Juan Morel, recorded as such by Houck in 1775. Juan and Hugh Morel had a grant in the St. Charles district. Francis Morel lived in New Madrid. Jean-Baptiste Morel was a boatman involved in lawsuits in Cahokia. The name of Pierre Dubois Morel was found in Sillery in 1666. Etienne Morel was a sailor and is listed in the same census as Pierre. The Irish connection is unsure, but he is listed as an Irish Catholic by Houck. In 1780, Henri Ora, or Henry O'Hara, claimed land near St. Louis, and Tom Brady was listed as Hoosier of Cahokia. About this time, Matthew Kennedy was killed while fending off Indians from the rear of a wagon just outside the gates of safety. Kennedy lived in St. Genevieve. In 1789, Major George McCully was in a party of 70 settlers under the command of Colonel Morgan in St. Genevieve. Few of this party of American settlers remained for long. Others continued to arrive. Philip Fine, son of Thomas Fine, was an Irish settler in Virginia, arriving in St. Louis in 1781. Soldiers and priests were needed to serve the growing area. The Spanish commandant wrote for a priest to serve the area and requested that it might be one of the Irish nation. Father James Maxwell arrived shortly thereafter. Stationing himself at St. Genevieve, he became well known and loved in the area. This Irish priest, Father Maxwell, later helped establish an Irish colony and became one of the first territorial representatives to President Jefferson. Some of Father Maxwell's flock might have taken the oath of allegiance at New Madrid in 1789, as did the following: James MacDonald, Cornelius Duffy, subsequently Stephen Burke, capital B-A-T-T period, M. Laughlin, Philip Boyle, Joan Gill, and Patrick Laughlin, 1793. Michael Moore and Joseph McCourtney are listed as Protestant Irish taking the oath in 1794. Michael Ryan, James O'Bune or O'Brien, Robert O'Hara, Matthew McCormick or McCormick, Guillaume Dugan, and George McGee had all taken the oath by 1795. Robert Morrison was an Irish merchant arriving in Kaskaskia in 1792. Anthony Mellecky, another Irishman, came to Madrid from the settlement at Vincennes and also resided at Little Prairie. As early as 1791, Irishmen had settled on the river and its tributaries. Jesse Kane lived on the Merrimack. John Dowlin or Dolan was located between the Merrimack River and Platten Creek. Patrick Fleming was an original owner of Mina Joe in 1790. Joel and Laurent McGagney were associated with Fleming, but the mine was abandoned in 1793. These were some of the first miners in the area. Later, in 1808, Irishman William Christie came from St. Louis to Blackwater Township to operate Missouri lead mines. He became a leading citizen of St. Louis. Military tradition continues. Major Doyle was a commandant of Fort Massac on the Ohio River in 1795. George Reagan was in charge of the cavalry, and Don Roberts McCoy, captain of the 2nd Company of Militia at New Madrid in 1797. Don George N. Carmichael was the commander of the post of Campo de la Esperanza as late as 1804. Large landowners, such as James Mackey, a Scotsman, were among the first English-speaking settlers to arrive prior to increased military protection. James Mackey was a Canadian fur trader and director of the Missouri Fur Company operations in the Indian Country. They left for St. Louis in August 1795, heading north along the Missouri River to reach the Pacific Ocean. After the cession, he acquired many land titles. While living in St. Charles, Missouri, he allowed his valuable maps and journals to be copied by Lewis and Clark. Others arrived in Missouri visiting relatives who arrived earlier. James Kerr, an Irish Presbyterian whose father had come from Ireland, came with his wife on horseback from Kentucky in 1799 to visit his daughter who had arrived 2 years earlier. The wife of the first governor of Missouri owes some debt to this time period. Antoine Riley was a bondsman for Dubreuilville who came to St. Louis from Canada. One of his daughters married Alexander McNair, the first governor of Missouri and the 4th sheriff of St. Louis. The role of the Irish becomes increasingly significant in the 1790s. By 1798, the first group Irish settlement had been made in the Bois Brule Bottom, which held the Kellys, Flynns, O'Neills, Crosbys, McLenahans, McLaughlins, McConaughey's, and McLean's. That same year, the Murphy settlement began in St. Francois County, 25 miles from Mine-a-Breton. This marked the beginnings of the city of Farmington and a religious congregation. Jesse McMahon arrived in America before the Revolution and made several hunting expeditions in the area by 1804. James Flaherty was a large landholder in 1799 with 600 arpents of land. William Sullivan, the first constable and coroner of St. Louis, arrived during the Spanish regime. In June 1804, he purchased from M. Lisa the old Barrere Bakery. In December, he was appointed to the respected position of constable and coroner. According to the History of Missouri by Houck, the following individuals settled on or near the Mississippi during the Spanish regime in Missouri. In 1798, Michael McKay, or McCoy, had lands near Chester. In 1803, he sold to John McGee, who sold that year to Michael Quinn of Cape Girardeau. In a few years, the property passed to Robert McMahon of Randolph County, Illinois. Other settlers near the river included Thomas Rardon or Reardon in 1802 near the Platten, along with Peter McCormick. In 1803, Michael Quinn and Joseph McGee are recorded. The same year, James Bradshaw and Jacob Odom had a location at O'Donnell Spring, which was sold successively to John McFerrin and Andrew Kenny. Michael Reagan was listed as a resident along Patton Creek in 1800. 1 year later, William Dunn settled on the Barrens on St. Cosme Creek. Aquila Hagan arrived from Kentucky as the Moore, Berry, and Cox families settled near the Mississippi in 1801. Another resident of the Barrens was John Duval from Nelson County, Kentucky. He married Anna Donahoe, daughter of David Donahoe of St. Marie County. William Cowan, John Hawkins, and Leroy Elliott were witnesses to the marriage on St. Cosme. Here the author lists residents prior to 1804 in Missouri, taken from the works of Houck. A Statistical Census of New Madrid, 1797. Roberto McKay, or McCoy, Arthur Mellon, Juan Gilmore, Samuel Dorsey, Joseph McCourtney, a Protestant Irishman, Martin McCormick, or McCormick, Georges M. Reagan, Williams Murphy, Santiago Kavanagh, from Ireland, a blacksmith, Jacobo McFarlane, Jacobo M. Molan, or McMullen, Juan McClellan, Abner M. Kentock, or McIntosh, Michael Murphy, Thomas Newley, or Neely, Patrick Cohedy, or Cassidy, Dr. Hugh MacDonald Chisholm, from Kaskaskia, Anthony Mellicky, an Irishman, 1795, James Gill, from Drogheda, Ireland, on St. Anne, and the Penn Regiment in 1781, listed as Jacobo Gilt, Aaron Graham, James Reagan, Kath Brown, Fem Campbell. The above were extracted from 197 heads of families in New Madrid. Cape Girardeau, November 1st, 1803. Samuel Bradley, Timothy Connolly, Moses Hurley, William Murphy, Allen Mackenzie, James Doughty, William Doherty, captain in the War of 1812, Elijah Doherty, Jesse Kane, Henry Sheridan, Benijah Lafferty, Hugh Connolly, John McGee, Isaac Kelly, John McCarty, Michael O'Hogan, William Finnant, James McMillan, a saddler, the first settler at New Madrid, Jacob Kelly, David McMultry, Edmund Hogan, Alexander Milliken, Charles Finley, Joseph McGee, Alexander Giboney, in 1797 settled 5 miles west of Cape Girardeau. The contributors list 1799, New Bourbon. Jean Calivan, a salt maker. Jean Donahue, a planter from Maryland. Joseph Donahan, a planter. Jean Rovert, McLaughlin, a planter. Thomas Donahue, planter. Jessa Healy, Guillaume or William Murphy Sr., Guillaume William Murphy Jr., Thomas Madden, William Kelly, a cooper from Kentucky, born in Ireland, and James McLean of Virginia. Note, the variant spellings given here have been confirmed. Names are often spelled in several different ways. The matter is complicated further by the influence of the Spanish language. One must pay attention to the sound of the name rather than a specific spelling. These names were extracted from larger lists. They were chosen because of obvious relationships with Celtic names and spellings. The first Irish-American settlement. The most concentrated area of Irish settlement in the 1790s was in the Boy Brule Bottom and up along the Boy Brule Creek. South of St. Genevieve, running along the Mississippi in Perry County, this area is bordered on the north by St. Lawrence Creek and on the south by St. Cosme Creek, which has been known since the earliest times as Boy Brule Bottom. The bottom was separated from the American Bottom on the east by the Mississippi River. Opposite the upper end of the bottom was Kaskaskia. Actively settled in the late 1790s and the early 1800s, this fertile farmland was not always desirable. According to Ellis in The Influence of the Environment on the Settlement of Missouri, 1929, the following conditions existed. The land was level with thick, gluey soil, which led to bayous, mosquitoes, chills, malaria, typhoid, and brain fever, to name a few of the maladies of the day. We quote, "Probably no settlers suffered more than those in the Boy Brule Bottom in the southeast part of the St. Genevieve district. St. Genevieve and New Bourbon were the two main areas served by the Irish priest James Maxwell. Father Maxwell attempted to establish a colony of Celts during his tenure, and we assume the bottom was part of his efforts. In Perry County, the Irish settled on the Barrens, as well as the Boy Brule. The Barrens was the training ground for the builder of Kansas City, Father Bernard Donnelly, in the 1850s. Donnelly was responsible for an Irish settlement of Kansas City beginning in 1856. Of infamous note is one of the earliest recorded murders in Upper Louisiana. Mr. Stone murdered John O'Connor, who had settled in the bottom in 1799 as a part of the growing number of Irish settlers. In 1803, O'Connor's property was sold at public auction to William Lowry, a merchant of St. Genevieve who lived on Indian Creek in 1802. Considering that the entire population of Missouri was only 6,028 in 1799, the Boy Brule Bottom was one of Missouri's earliest ethnic settlements, outside of the original French and Spanish outposts. The following settlers are listed in Ellis' work as inhabitants of the Boy Brule Bottom and Creek. John W. McClanahan of Virginia in 1796 was on Mill Creek and started a mill in 1797. Christopher Barnard in 1794 was near the town of St. Mary's in St. Genevieve County. Jacob Crow, 1795. Lewis Dixon, 1796. William Burns, 1796, in 1799 in St. Charles. David Clark, 1796, from Kaskaskia. John Graham, 1796, from Illinois. Thomas Allen, 1797, adjacent to the settlement at Barron's and on Negro Fork of the Merrimack River in 1803. Barnabas Burns came in 1784, lived here until 1797, later on Cape St. Cosme. James Burns, 1797, who married Elizabeth Shelby of New Madrid. James Burns on Crooked Creek in the Cape Girardeau district. Michael and Benjamin Burns, Joseph Donahoe, 1797, on the Mississippi and St. Laurent. Jean Jolin, 1797. John Ross McLaughlin, 1797. Alexander McConaughey, 1797. James McLean, 1797, as a worker. Benjamin Walker, 1797. Samuel Bridge, 1798, from Massachusetts. Elias Cohen, 1798, worker, and received a grant to open a mill in 1800. Andrew Cox, 1798. Thomas Cochran, 1798. Jonas Dutton, 1798. James Dodge, 1798, of Kentucky, who sold to Timothy Kelly in 1801. Joshua Dodson, 1798, of Kentucky, who also sold to Timothy Kelly in 1801. James Conovan was in partnership with him. Thomas Donahue, 1799, had a tan yard on the Saline. Joshua Fisher, 1799. Robert McLaughlin, 1799. William Flynn and his son William in 1800. William Fitzgibbons, 1800. John Harvin, 1800. John Kennison. John Morgan, Jr. of North Carolina, 1800. Henry Hatton, 1799. James Murdoch, 1800. Thomas Tucker, 1801. Archibald and Solomon Morgan, 1802. Josiah Millard, 1805. Alexander Murdoch, 1803, opposite Pole Island on the Mississippi. Elizabeth Carnes, 1802. David Cripps, 1803. Richard Hawkins, 1803. Joseph Hagan, 1803. James Cowan, or Cohen. Elisha Crosby. Jacob Reed and James Wright lived here but moved to Brushy Bayou, Rapides Parish, Louisiana. Archibald Comster, Benjamin Cox, and Peter O'Neill were witnesses to the wedding of Joseph Hilaire of Canada and Rachel Egan's of North Carolina. This is a partial listing of known inhabitants. German and French settlers are documented here, as well as Irish. It was, however, the first Irish group settlement in Missouri, according to Ellis. The French settlers were declining in number, and the German settlers were not to arrive in significant numbers until some 30 years later. The Irish would become the largest foreign population in St. Louis by 1820. It is interesting to note that this was an agricultural settlement made by the Irish. Irish status in the 1700s. Although small in numbers, By the end of the century, a true Irish settlement was in place in Missouri. Matthew Kennedy, a resident of St. Genevieve, is recorded in St. Louis in 1771. Slain by Indians less than 10 years later, he was the overseer of an estate under the Spanish regime. His position may be assumed to have been more than an average achievement. Juan Morel, listed by the Spanish authorities as an Irish Catholic in 1775, we know little of. Others of that surname are documented there earlier. How many Irish there were at that time is a matter of speculation. Father James Maxwell arrived in the 1790s after a request was made for an Irish Catholic priest to minister in the area. He stationed himself at St. Genevieve prior to the growth of St. Louis. At least some Irish were in need of his services there. Not only was a priest of the Irish nation specifically requested, but he went on to become one of the first territorial representatives to President Jefferson in the early 1800s. William Sullivan arrived during the Spanish regime and became constable and coroner for St. Louis in 1804. The beginnings of the town of Farmington developed when the Murphy settlement was made in St. Francois County in 1798. The first settler in New Madrid was named McMillan. By 1798, the first group settlement was in place south of St. Genevieve in the Bois Brule Bottom. Irishmen are found in the 1700s as blacksmiths, saddlers, salt makers, planters, and estate overseers in Missouri. Military positions told of a degree of respect and authority. Reagan was in charge of the cavalry, and McCoy the 2nd Company of Militia in New Madrid. Carmichael commanded yet another post. Of some importance to the area was Major Doyle. Doyle was commandant of Fort Massac on the Ohio River, a major transportation route. O'Reilly governed the lands of Louisiana, which included Missouri, while commanding the Spanish Armada in 1770. Antoine Riley was an early settler from Canada. His daughter later married the first governor of Missouri, Alexander McNair. The Spanish and French were allied with and depended upon these Irish settlers. Although not yet as numerous as the original French and Spanish settlers, the Irish soon became the largest foreign-born group in St. Louis. In both numbers and accomplishments, the Irish would soon overshadow all other European immigrants in the earliest decades of the 1800s. The lands west of the Mississippi would become an American possession in 1804, and the Irish would begin their rise to preeminence under American rule. The western lands had been controlled by powers hostile to Britain and were of Roman Catholic religious background. Both of these factors contributed to the settlement of the Irish in the region. The West was still considered a vast wasteland by many. Those with vision knew different.
End of Disc 1. Continued on Disc 2 of Missouri Irish by Michael C. O'Laughlin.